Assalamu alaikum, marhaban, bonjour et bienvenue. Good morning and welcome. So I have the pleasure to be the MC only for this session because after this one, we'll be working hard. So this is the day, and by design, we try to get us on the same page, preparing for the conversation that will start after this session. So it is today when we try to develop some ideas together to make the world a better place. So over the first day in the opening plenary, we were moved, and I think a lot of us, we left that plenary session feeling what is really the suffering and what happened in this country. And the testimony of that young fellow who asked the questions at the end, and what we heard from PARIKH yesterday, was a reminder of how those kind of mistakes that happens one day, maybe for good or bad reason, can lead to catastrophes, can lead to different kind of paths. Yesterday, we tried through different sessions, and including this morning, to develop what we call a common awareness. Because one thing that we have observed, we come to these different issues from our own biases, and we try actually to address them from our own expertise and our own eyes. So the forum, the way how we try to design it is to create this kind of common understanding. So when we talk about economy, we bring into that the other dimensions. When we talk about environment, we bring the other dimensions, and so on and so forth. So today, we hope that we will be able to find ideas for making the world a better place. And the world will become a better place when we start with ourselves. So a better place for you, better place for me, better place for her, for him, for all of us. And I would like to remind you what came from the first day when Mary Ann Thomas asked us to walk together. And I think in this togetherness, this is where I would like to go. So for me, diversity is a fact. We have been created, or the nature created us, whatever your belief, we are different. Inclusion is an act, is building constructive relationship to move us forward. And as you will hear from this first panel, in a study, there is the business case that inclusion is beneficial. We see it in nature, we see it in our societies, we see it in corporations, but the evidence is already there. And by the way, I have a good news for you. You heard Lord Elderdice yesterday saying there are only 25% in maximum. They are like us, believing that diversity and inclusion is something good, and believing in you can do well by doing good, and this is not a zero-sum game. And it is more than enough, because, and I'm happy to elaborate on that, there is a proof it takes only 10% dedicated to change the system. We have two and a half times that people are committed to this. So it is my pleasure, before I introduce the panel, to thank a few key people who made this as what it is. So the name that you see here on the slide are all of those people who worked hard making this happen. There are many, many more who have been involved in one way or another, but these ladies, they are behind what you see today. So please give them a round of applause and thank them. And their merit is to have supported me for this long. So next, please. So I am happy to I will come back after this session. Please stay seated. I would like to remind you of what you are expecting from the think tanks and what is going to happen during the day. But remember that we are going to be at the Government House at the end of the day to present the highlight of the big ideas that we are developing today. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rita, Perth, sorry. I was practicing with her. I'm so bad with names. Sorry So she comes to us from Vancity, and we are thankful to Vancity for their support for the forum. Vancity have been always thinking about making good with the money, and this is how they were being structured. So RITA is a long-time supporter of cooperative. RITA is committed to Vancity vision of transforming wealth and enhancing community health. She brings more than 20 years of leadership experience in educational, community development, and regulatory organizations to the board of directors. Please help me welcome RITA.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here to welcome you to this morning's session. Like others, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, represented by the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I acknowledge that while we are marking the 150th year of Confederation, these lands were under the custodianship of Indigenous peoples for many years before 1867. So, an emerging theme over the last couple of days has been that inclusion is not an end goal. Rather, it's a process. And it's a process of continuous learning, of reflection, of experimentation, of humility and action. It's a journey. So I want to spend just a minute talking about Vancity's journey, where we're at and where we're going. Vancity, as some of you know, was founded 70 years ago by a group of community members who could not get credit through traditional banks. So they formed a cooperative to meet their community needs. We've been working since that time to address the financial needs of marginalized people to the greatest extent we can. Some of you know, for instance, that Vancity was the first financial institution in BC to offer loans to women without requiring a male signatory. That was a long time ago. Since then, recently we launched Fair and Fast, which is an online, it's a loan that members can apply for without a fee online, and it's an alternative, a low interest alternative to the exploitative loan practices of the payday loan companies that you see in the community. Vancity also offers financial literacy programs, and they cover everything from how to do basic banking and what credit is, and how to use a credit card, and how to do tax filing, to budgeting, and how to use your bank card. We offer that through the public library system, and in the last decade, we've reached out to about 20,000 people. We've offered these workshops in about 30 different languages. But at Vancity, we also talk about inclusion in terms of our board and our staff. So 8 of the 9 board members at Vancity are women, 3 are women of color. 1 is an outspoken advocate in the LGBTQ community. Our CFO and our CEO are both women. And when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report in 2015, the board added reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as one of our core values. So we are working on what that means for us as a financial institution. This year, for instance, more than 50% of our staff and all our board will have gone through a reconciliation workshop, and that will change the dialogue that we have internally and the way we relate to our members and the kinds of services and the way in which we offer our services. But inclusion for us is also about the movements in which we participate. And just last weekend, a fellow board member, Jan O'Brien, and I were at a conference on platform co-ops. And that's a new movement that has really arose in response to the digital sharing, so-called sharing economy, represented by the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the TaskRabbits, where billions are made by investors, but very rarely invested and shared with the workers in their own communities. So, and I think this is where economic inclusion experimenting gets really exciting, because we heard from all kinds of people, domestic workers, childcare workers, photographers, artists, drivers, who have come together to form digital platforms to offer their services and their platforms where they control and use the data. They put that data to serve them in their own communities. They reap, retain, and invest the profits, and they have decision-making power over their own organizations. We heard from an Uber driver, a former Uber driver in the States who'd formed a co-op. We heard from a series of domestic workers who are working with labor to provide a platform where they can get benefits like sick leave and vacation pay. And then finally, we heard from the Boston-based Center for Economic Democracy, which is experimenting with with how financial institutions like ours can be drivers of social change by, for instance, offering lower interest rates to businesses that declare themselves living wage employers, or that they're looking at how to create social impact covenants between lenders and recipients, businesses. Or they're establishing, and this was such a great example, community investment funds that both offer a solid return to investors and contribute to the community. So the example they gave was one where individuals, individuals and institutions, regardless of whether they're contributing $100,000 or $50, have one vote, and together they collectively decide how to allocate and invest that money in their own communities. So that brings us to today. You can see how addressing economic exclusion and economic inclusion is incredibly exciting. It's with great pleasure and great excitement that I get to introduce the moderator of the panel this morning. That's Jennifer Petrella. Jennifer is the Director of Content and Strategic Engagement at the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, which supports research and engagement in the humanities and social sciences. She started at the foundation after 8 years as a writer and editor for multilateral development banks and governments and academic bodies. Jennifer has worked in Brazil, in France, in the States, and the Philippines, and she earned a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Bachelor in the History of the Developing World from McGill University, and a Master of Science in Environmental Health from the Université de Montréal. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You know, I had to hold myself back there because there's a seat beside Kamal, and I thought Rita would be perfect for that seat. Inclusive social economic progress. She's all about that. So thank you very much, Rita, for helping bring this Victoria Forum to us today. So good morning, everybody. As you know, my name is Jennifer Petrella. It's a great honor for me to be here with my fellow colleagues here to talk about inclusive social economic progress. I'd like to start by acknowledging the University of Victoria, Global Affairs Canada. Of course, we've acknowledged the territory that we're all on today. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. We have 3 here and 1 who's going to be on the screen behind you in an instant. And then I'm going to explain to you how we're going to structure this very brief time that we have together. So to start with our panelists, we have here Kamal Al-Sulaili. Kamal is an award-winning author, and he is a professor of journalism at Ryerson University. He's the author of Brown. If anybody here has read it, they'll know that it's a fabulous book, but don't trust me. It's won major prizes, including the Shaughnessy Cohen Award for Political Writing. It's a great book. Christian is going to be on the screen in a second, so I'll move right along. Carol Ann Hilton is a First Nations business leader and the holder of an international MBA. She's the CEO of Transformation International, an award-winning First Nation social and economic development company, and she was recently appointed as senior advisor on the Canadian Federal Economic Growth Council that advises Federal Finance Minister Morneau on Canadian economic growth. Carol Ann is an instructor at Simon Fraser University's Community Economic Development Program. She's the faculty lead at the Banff Centre for Indigenous Business, and she's the director both of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada and the National Canadian Economic Development Network. Hi, Christian. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. Great. So we're speaking to Christian. He's in Whistler. Christian Kittleson is a partner at Ernst & Young. He's the lead on government and public service sector in BC, and he's the firm's national lead on Indigenous practice. Christian is a former Assistant Deputy Minister of BC for Natural Resources, and he is a former Chief Financial Officer for the world's largest helicopter service company. He was responsible for their operations in Australia and Southeast Asia. And finally, right here on my right is Gillian Sturck. Jill is a former Canadian ambassador and a 2015 mentor at the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. Until June 2013, she was Chief Foreign Policy Officer and Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategic Policy, Global Issues, and European Affairs at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. So you see that on this panel we have finance, we have economics, we have government, we have media, we have social affairs. Very high-hitting panel. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Briefly, the way that we are going to structure the panel this morning is going to be as follows. We have 40 minutes left, and we wish to reserve the last 10 minutes for a summary by our panelists. So that leaves us 30 minutes for a discussion and a kind of question and answer period with the crowd. Now, if these 4 people are experts in their fields, I know that there are many, many more experts in this room. Inclusive social economic process is not something that can be remedied with the expertise of 4 people, no matter how well experienced. So I have been speaking to some of you in breaks and so forth, and we're going to be calling on you later. Calling on you not only to raise your hands and tell us what questions you have for these people and what issues you think need to be raised, but also if you have expertise or evidence, the Victoria Forum is supposed to be an interactive discussion with you, drawing on your expertise and evidence. So if a question comes up that you know the answer to, please signal and I will scan and try to find you, and we'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's proceed to the questions that we have for our panelists. So I'd like to start with Kamal and Carol Ann to talk about inclusivity. So inclusive social economic progress, the first word is inclusive. That is a very hard question. Who do we include? Who do we exclude? So maybe I could ask you, Kamal, to start. How would you define inclusivity in this area, and how does Canada measure up in your experience?
Sure. Well, I define inclusivity when we get to the point where at the moment, 1 in 3 immigrants who come to Canada live below the poverty line, whereas that number is 1 in 8 for the general population. Only a quarter of immigrants to Canada work in the professions in which they qualified for to come to Canada. Only a quarter, 1 in 4. So I define economic inclusivity as the moment when we start addressing these issues and addressing our fetish or hunger for bringing people into this country and then not allowing them to live up to their full potential economically, professionally. I think we do have an addiction on immigration, largely for a number of reasons, but one of them is clearly because immigration has become the major way of getting cheap labor into the country. So I would define inclusivity economically when these issues are addressed.
Mm-hmm. So if 300,000 people, newcomers to our country every year, aren't working in work that draws on their talents, their expertise, their education, we are letting a lot of talent kind of go down the drain.
We're wasting talent and brain power, in part because we also need unskilled labor as well. Mm-hmm. So we have one way of getting that unskilled labor is to continue underinvesting in the professional accreditation and the professional progress of our newcomers.
Carol Ann, what is your take?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I see economic inclusivity, and to be able to observe it, we need to be able to look within the margins of this country. If we look within the margins of this country, what we see is that Indigenous people have, if you look at the structure of margins, it's 90-10. If you look at the structures of the marginalization of Indigenous people within this country, you see the highest percentage of Indigenous peoples in jails, children in care. The statistics go on and on and on. It's within that marginalization that there's room for socioeconomic inclusion and participatory frameworks that allow a continued representation of Indigenous people and solutions within those issues. If we look specifically at that as an issue, marginalization is an overrepresentation of a mainstream worldview. When we can look and examine from that perspective, that's the starting point for economic inclusion.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So, your point of view is that we actually have to go beyond the figures to look at a little bit what comes before, to redefine the way that we relate to each other, in fact.
Absolutely, and I see the levels and numbers of marginalization at that kind of 90-10 structure that requires honesty and requires looking at that as actual performance measures of this country.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Christian, can you hear me? Yes, everything's good? When you were an assistant deputy minister for BC, you developed this collaborative process where Indigenous communities kind of defined a vision for what they saw as inclusive socioeconomic process, and they communicated that vision to governments instead of the other way around. And you were telling me that kind of produced some unexpected priorities. So it could have been Indigenous, it could have been the revitalization of Indigenous languages, or it could have been environmental monitoring, or it could have been resource development, not necessarily in that order. And then you went a step further and developed this model for government resource revenue sharing that, again, in a context of an Indigenous community wishing to develop, looked at ways to reframe resource development within the context not merely of an exchange, an economic exchange with respect only to those resources, but within as one component of a larger kind of negotiation about well-being and prosperity. How did that influence how you look at inclusivity and progress?
Well, just to start with, I think the challenge that we felt was occurring in government and our relationship with Indigenous was we were seeing a very approach, which was have representatives from the Indigenous community on one side, and we had representatives from the government on the other side. And this was taking a long time and not necessarily producing the outcomes that were desired outcomes or the desired interests of the actual community itself. So what we found was that the collaborative design process was actually removing the representatives of the interest and actually having the true interest in the room and starting to create a shared vision of what the future needs to be for those interests. And what ended up happening was we were starting to see a tremendous acceleration of that process, but we were also a little bit surprised to see what the outcomes of the process were. Typically, we would be sitting there thinking about things like hiring and dollars, man's title, those types of things, but when the actual interests were in the room...
Christian, I'm going to stop you because the sound is really bad. Okay, sorry about that. So maybe somebody can work on the sound and we'll come back to you, all right? Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. What Christian was saying to me yesterday on the phone was, if you don't mind me speaking for you a little bit, Christian, is that this model of working together has actually expanded greatly the possibilities, because as soon as you come to an agreement on principles, where revenue resource sharing is not merely an exchange, which, number one, doesn't use representatives to bargain, but uses the people in the room, you expand the possibilities. People become more willing to entertain resource development within a context of achieving greater goals. And so then you have a model that where dissent can actually be integrated into the whole negotiation, and people become willing to look at possibilities that they weren't looking at before. So resource development no longer becomes a question of this single river, this single mine, but actually becomes one of many tools that can be used to achieve, greater literacy or whatever the goal the Indigenous community might define. So that's one way of achieving inclusivity, is to getting governments to kind of look at negotiating on a different level, more of a nation-to-nation kind of level. That seems to work well when all the peoples at the table have a bargaining chip. Kamal, you deal with populations that don't have those kinds of bargaining chips necessarily.
Right.
Many of Canada's visible minorities, are undocumented or they're waiting for status. Does that change the power relationship?
It does, because we are literally not at the table, and we are talked at and not talked to, or not talked. We're not having general conversations. To me, I mean, the issue of inclusion is not just about a company that has, 10% visible minority, but who are the decision makers in these companies? So for me, in the media, for example, I worked at the Globe and Mail for 7 years. I am the only non-white critic in the history of the Globe and Mail, for example, arts writer and critic in the Globe and Mail. That paper never had a person of color or a woman as editor-in-chief. So it is about the distribution. It's not just about having a diverse workforce or having people included in the company, but it's about the decision makers, about positions of power and also visibility and high visibility positions. So I think that's where our communities, when I talk about our communities, I talk about the communities I described in my book, Brown, are not part of the conversation. Okay, I guess that's an echo.
Oh, God. Can
right.
somebody stop that squeaking?
Okay, I think I'm done, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, so Kamal, more and more we're seeing brownness and indigeneity as a plus, right? So there's great appetite for indigenous expertise in universities these days. Yeah. We saw Silicon Valley kind of get up in arms against Trump's immigration ban. I'm going to turn to Jill now, because I'd like to know a little bit more about the study that you did that kind of started, that questioned to whether brownness or visible minority, is seen as an asset or a liability in the business world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say it was an interesting study. We looked at the relationship between diversity in the workplace and both revenue and productivity. And there was kind of a quantitative piece where we took a whole set of statistics and did some analysis there. But we also talked to companies, to settlement organizations, to different organizations involved in working with different communities to get their perspective on the role of diversity in the workplace. And what we found was that there is a very clear positive correlation between diversity and both revenue and productivity across 14 sectors, but particularly in those sectors where creativity and knowledge and so on is at a premium. So we felt that was very encouraging. But I thought what was even more interesting was what people in the business world told us. And they said, for them, diversity was an opportunity to expand the talent pool. It was an opportunity to foster creativity and innovation, because you get that kind of creative tension in the workplace between different ideas, different perspectives. It also allowed businesses to think about how to generate new products and services to target different demographic groups and potentially open up new markets both in Canada and abroad. So I think the business community felt very strongly that diversity was important to them, and not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it was also important in terms of their revenue and productivity. But I have to say, they all acknowledged that there remain significant barriers to achieving those goals, and those are some of the things that Kamal, you've spoken about. And I can talk a little bit more about that later if you like, Jennifer.
Jill, can you give us an idea of the order of magnitude?
Yes, for a 1% increase in diversity in the workforce led to a 2.4% increase in productivity, and a 2.4% increase in revenue, and a 1% increase in productivity. But as I said, this was much higher in those creative industries like business services, for example, the technology industries, and the creative industries like media and so on.
Okay, I'm interested in what you were just saying, Jill, about measures to promote inclusivity, and I think that it's going to be a very interesting discussion. We have 15 minutes left before the summary, so I don't want to neglect our audience. I think that there's really great expertise in the room. So let me ask you, is there anything that you want to ask the panelists? Is there any aspect of diversity, of inclusion that you want to bring up now? Yes?
Yesterday we had the same problem, and the speaker was asked to get closer to the microphone, which made it so we only saw his eyes, but we could at least hear him.
Christian, did you hear that? If you get close to the mic, very, very, very close, you only want to see your eyes? Okay, great, perfect. Okay, does anybody have any questions right now, or should we turn to Christian? Any questions, anybody? No? Christian, what comments do you have on some of the exchanges that we've had so far? What do you want to tell us about government resource revenue sharing?
Is this a little bit better?
Yes, this is better.
Okay, great. Well, I think the statement that I would make is that we're missing a tremendous opportunity with the non-inclusivity of Indigenous communities across this country. I'll talk a lot about a business case. The reality is that there is a tremendous business case for the inclusion of Indigenous communities across the country. And the process to allowing for that inclusivity to occur is really what we need to roll up our sleeves and design.
Right. So perhaps this is a good time to talk about measures to promote inclusivity. We're going to ask our panelists to suggest some ideas. But I'd like once again to give the first right of refusal to the audience. Is there anybody who has something that they'd like to bring up? Please.
May I take the mic?
Sure.
I agree with everything that has been said so far.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Derek Fraser. I'm at the Center for Global Studies. I agree with everything that has been said so far, but there's one element of inclusivity that hasn't been taken into account and that can be dangerous. If you take a look at the circumstances that have produced the populist reaction in the last presidential election in the United States, as well as in the Brexit vote, it is first the stagnation of lower class and lower middle class salaries for several years. In Britain, it was 15 years. A fraying of the social safety net and a lack or a bad amount of class mobility.
Perfect. That's an excellent point. Thank you for raising that.
And it seems to me that we have to take this into consideration in Canada as a whole. Mm-hmm. The disparity of income in Canada is only slightly better than in Britain. We have a high level of social mobility. We have to take into account our social safety net.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So, Kamal.
I couldn't hear everything said, but it's about social mobility, and one of my main arguments in my book is that earlier generations of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Ireland and Italy in the 20th century have been able to reach that kind of social mobility because of stable jobs, because of a real estate boom, because of many other factors that have contributed to their integration into mainstream Canada. At the moment, the majority of immigrants to Canada are coming and experiencing really precarious work environments that's not allowing them to transition easily into the middle class, to transition easily into sort of to lose that hyphenation of becoming whatever, Arab Canadian, Indo Canadian, and the problem is we need to create the environment of equality and socioeconomic progress so that everyone can thrive. Without that, what we're actually creating is an underclass of immigrants who are living outside the cities where they work and are not, and in more than one case, it's not the first generation of immigrants who do well, but they invest in their children. So you have, the parents who came here are not actually living up to their full potential, and that's a major problem.
Carol Ann, do you have ideas to add to that?
Sure. As a senior advisor on the Federal Economic Growth Council, what I have seen of late is that Canada has taken a leading global role in inclusivity with an agenda specifically aimed at inclusive economic growth. It could have just been looked at economic growth, but adding the inclusive took the conversation to an entirely different level that allowed us the space as the Growth Council to have an analysis of what is inclusive. So the recommendations that we created for the finance minister as examples such as an infrastructure bank, the future skills, the immigration, those as examples, we had to be able to take a close look at what was the concept, how would it unfold, what specifically was the intention, and in what ways and why was it inclusive. So there was a level of honesty that had to be able to be relayed that identified in that honesty of where are we actually at as a country, and to say we're inclusive also meant in what ways are we not inclusive, and to be able to identify that within the process required that level of honesty within the development of those recommendations, and seeing the implementation of those over the next couple of years will be an important construct of inclusion in this country.
Excellent. Do you think that we're going to see replacement of GDP as our prime analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was also, I think there was two sets of measurements. One, GDP growth based on inclusion as well as lived experiences. So for example, if infrastructure funding was better targeted to, let's say, an example of a faster train into the city, how would that change Canadian lives specifically in regards to better quality of life, ability to access jobs, that there was a whole kind of set of filters that looked at what did inclusivity do and how did that look at GDP from a regional perspective.
Yep. Well, it's good to hear that that's being, mainstream taken up. I know that that's a discourse at the OECD and at the World Bank. So now we need to trickle it down national and subnational level. Does anybody want to add anything to that or have a question of their own?
Yeah, I've had a question.
Oh, hi, Stacey.
Hi. I'm Stacey Fitzsimmons. I'm a faculty here at the Gustavson School of Business, and this is Douglas. He's very into diversity and inclusion. Actually, I'd love to hear you address something that I've struggled with in my own research about the two different arguments for diversity and inclusion within organizations. I've heard you talk a lot about the business case for diversity, right? And the argument there is that diversity promotes higher performance within organizations, and therefore is something that organizations ought to promote. But it also begs the question that if you find a negative or neutral relationship, then organizations don't have to do it. On the other hand, there's the organizations should promote diversity because it's the right thing to do, which is also a compelling argument, but possibly more difficult to implement. So I would love to hear you, how you contrast those and which one you think is more compelling, how to address them both.
Kamal, I know that you're itching to answer that, but before we turn to you, we're going to give Christian a chance. Christian, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I would. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. I would say that there's the compelling argument is that it's the right thing to do. We at EY, for instance, in our firm, spend a lot of time making sure that the diversity of decision making, not only within the firm, but as we would prescribe to our clients, is very diverse. We just know that decisions are going to be better when there's a diversity of viewpoints on that. So it's just the right thing to do, and it makes sense in terms of having a better outcome at the end of the day.
What's your opinion, Kamal?
Well, I'm going to preface my opinion quickly by saying, of course, I agree it's both the right thing to do and it's the economically sound thing to do. And the study that Gillian and Besma have done is truly groundbreaking. But I want to say that there's a moral failure when we only see inclusion and diversity, and I'm including immigration policies, just in terms, in purely economic terms as well. We are people. We come here with dreams, with lives, with values, with culture, that I would like us to take that into consideration when we think of our policies, and not just because at the moment for every retiring baby boomer retiring, you need 4 workers to create that pension for them. Very soon it's going to be 2 workers. This is the argument in Doug Saunders' book, Maximum Canada. If we don't increase the number of immigrants, then every 2 workers will have to fund one person's pension plan. And I can see that. I agree with that. But we're not here to pay your retirement pension and your vacation and when you retire. I want us to have an immigration and diversity policies that also acknowledge the rich histories, the rich values that immigrants in general bring to this country. And in an ideal world, I also would like us to have the conversation about immigrants and indigeneity, not as separate conversations, but as part of the same conversation.
If I can jump in, Jennifer, I was just going to say, I think we very much see employment or workplace diversity as just one aspect of inclusion, but it can be quite an important one in the sense that meaningful employment, I think, is an important piece of inclusion, and it also brings people together from diverse backgrounds around common goals. And I think it was perhaps Lord Alderdice the other day who said how important it was to bring people from different perspectives, different backgrounds, to identify what is common between or among them. And so I think in that respect, the workplace piece is quite important in the larger conversation about inclusion. But I do agree entirely that inclusion is about much more than economics.
Mm-hmm. This is a steep hill to climb, I think. Yeah. Are there other comments from the audience before we turn to measures to promote inclusivity? Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Pamela Davinsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Mosaic Institute. My question is about the language that we all happen to be using yesterday and today, and more specifically about the word inclusion. I think one of the things that we're hearing from all of you is that this is not just about color, it's also about socioeconomic status, the mobility, the structure of our capitalist hierarchy. And that the notion of inclusion presumes a power base. It presumes in versus out. And there are those who control the foundation of the inside. And so if you figure out how to smell like us, talk like us, walk like us, we might kind of let you in. And I wonder if perhaps one of the more foundational challenges is to question the language that we use. Language embeds the truths and the biases of how we understand each other in the world. And it strikes me that the word inclusion in and of itself is a reflection of the problem. And if we only use language that reflects that is embedded and creates the problem, we'll never actually crack through to an effective solution. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about the word inclusion itself and perhaps other words in our language that reflect a discriminatory in versus out, us versus them understanding of the world.
I think that's right on. Carol Ann, I suspect that you have something to say about that.
Sure. So I've developed that's a fantastic question and comment. I've developed a line of thought called indigenomics, and the intention of it is to insert into Canadian consciousness the relevance of an Indigenous worldview. So without restraints of political restraints or legal restraints, the intention is really that an Indigenous worldview is not only relevant, but the requirement for space for Indigenous people in this country. The leadership is being created within the legal field. However, Canada is in both a legal and an economic relationship within this country with Indigenous people. The formation of this country was established on the Indian question, so the Indian problem. And with that, that has established to the modern question of that today is really actually how how powerful are we as Indigenous people. So we established this country as Indigenous people are a problem, the exclusion of people, the invisibility of Indigenous people. So past 150 plus years, now what we're seeing is how powerful are we as Indigenous people? How is that being facilitated? And the increased visibility and requirements for how we fit within this country is essentially what that looks like in terms of our ability to create an appropriate response. For what I see is that within the federal finance, the fiscal relationship between the government and Indigenous people, it's highly reflective of that sense of exclusion, of the ability to see that the current framework in the fiscal relationship is that 95% of funding that goes to Indigenous people is all socially based. So education, housing, social programs. 3% is reconciliation and 2% is economic development. So we live in a country with Indigenous people as the poorest people within this country, but also 2% that's not investable in terms of the ability to translate that into economic inclusion. Indigenous people are building the space for economic inclusion, and that's the essential piece, is that the leadership is coming from Indigenous people for inclusion and visibility, and that's the platform of how powerful we are as people. Thank you.
That represents a tremendous potential. I mean, if you turn those figures around just slightly, you can increase exponentially your effect.
And I think that's a piece around the visibility of understanding the cost, the perception of we cost this country money versus the investability of our relevance and intention within economic growth.
Wow. Well, that's very impressive. We are now at 9 minutes. And that is perfect because it leaves our panelists each 2 minutes to kind of sum up. So the panel organizers have asked us to do a kind of summary portion where each panelist tells us what he or she found most striking about the comments today, what he or she thinks are research questions that still have to be developed, what he or she thinks is the single most interesting or important piece that they're going to carry away. Jill, can we start with you?
Well, a couple of observations. One, I think what I heard here is that we can't just look at each aspect of inclusion or pluralism in isolation. And it isn't just about the economics, but it's really about the broader piece about what kind of a society do we want to create going forward. And I think that's certainly an important aspect. I think our diversity and our demographics present an enormous opportunity, that there is huge untapped potential right across this country, whether we're looking at Indigenous peoples or immigrants, whether they be new immigrants or those who have been here for some time. And we need to think about how we unlock that potential going forward. The work that I have done has kind of, I guess, posited that Canada's diversity is a huge, it's an opportunity, it's Canada's global advantage in a way, because it should allow us to connect to the world. It gives us that kind of cultural fluency, if you like, because we come from different backgrounds, bringing different perspectives, different experiences. That should be an opportunity to connect with others. And in an increasingly globalized world, none of the issues that we are grappling with, whether they're social issues, economic issues, environmental issues, are going to be solved by one country alone. And we should think about our diversity as an opportunity to look beyond our own borders.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Christian.
Yeah, really wonderful conversation. I think one of the things that's extremely important to consider is the process that we're going to follow for this inclusion. And I think that question around the words or the pattern language that we use is very important. I would rather use a language like partnership and the building of trust, which is a challenge that stands in our way for that inclusion to occur. We're very quick these days to engineer tools or engineer solutions, and sometimes those tools don't fit. What I like to do is I like to find ways to create a common intent or a common philosophy, common culture between the diversity of those populations. Once we have that, I think we're on our way to building trust and having a truly equal partnership and equality across this country between all of those diverse types of.
Yeah, partnerships first. Carol Ann.
Thank you. I really enjoy that concept that inclusion has to be more than just about economics. It has to be about our lived reality. I see that much as on the research that you're looking at as well, is that the potential of those numbers is what is the performance of inclusion within this country, and in what ways and filters do we look at that? We live in a rapidly changing world, and the requirements of inclusion, the pressures of that are continuously showing themselves that we need to be able to do things differently. From an Indigenous perspective, I see specifically that the government's approach has been the reduction of strength of claim, so our relationship to the lands. From that as a legal construct, what I've seen is that now with inclusion and with the ability that is now facilitating itself as strength of relationship. In what ways is strength of relationship presents itself within our treaty relationships, within our existing negotiations? That strength of relationship will require new actions, new beliefs, and new response to a rapidly growing Indigenous economy. Some of the work that I do in Indigenomics specifically is around looking at the TD economic report that identified the Indigenous economy currently at $32 billion. It was estimated to come in at in 2016. It came in at $32 billion with premature evaluation on those numbers. I'd take that within the Growth Council context to say, in what way as a country do we respond to the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy? That is what inclusion looks like in this country, and that is what the honesty that says the strength of our relationship and the central role of Indigenous people. When we get that, when we're able to create the structures, the policy response, the regulatory environment, that's what inclusion will look like in this country, specifically in regards to the Indigenous relationship. Thank you.
Nice. Come on.
Okay, I too would. I mean, I want to think about it more about the issue of language and the term inclusion and partnership, which Christian just proposed as well. I think Caroline as well implies, because I want to believe that there is another model, but I am also realistic and realize where the power lies in Canadian economy and Canadian society, and it cannot be a partnership if we're not equal economically and socially. So that's why I'm hesitant, because I thought we came a long way from when diversity was a fact and inclusion is a policy, and I was quite happy with inclusion, but now I have to challenge myself on that a little bit. I'm very fascinated with your model in particular, but I also would like us to think about the brain drain issue. Is that when we are inviting 250,000 to 300,000 immigrants to Canada every year, and one thing, we're not making the most of them here, but also brain draining some of the doctors and engineers and teachers and nurses and social entrepreneurs out of developing countries. I want us to think about our moral responsibility when we do that.
Excellent point. So we have a lot to think about. Our time is up, so allow me first to thank the audience for your great thinking.
There's one question from somebody here. I've been waiting.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes and 10 seconds, so we're listening.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for acknowledging me. I really appreciate everything that's been said, and I realize I only have 2 minutes, and that's fine. I'm so glad you talked about moral failure, and I totally agree. I'm born and raised in this country, so to be really brief, my name is Meharuna Ghani. I'm with the North Shore Multicultural Society, but I've been doing this work since I was 8 years old. That's 40 years now. And I'm a public speaker, and I'm a consultant in diversity education. So on the front lines of the work that I do I have created community conversations and talking circles, and on the front line, and I'm so glad that there was last two people who came up and talked about some of the reality of language and diversity and inclusion, and I feel we haven't really, and I know we don't have enough time, we need to get deeper in what is inclusion and what is making us uncomfortable. And let's not be polite about it, because in the conversations I have conducted, I have heard there is fear, there is guilt, there is fragility, there is a sense of entitlement, there's a sense of power and privilege that crosses all people. And it doesn't matter if you're a person of color, what gender you are, there is all of this that is manifesting and that's surfacing. When I see and encounter swastikas in different places, that's a different reality. And so we need to get dirty and talk about the uncomfortable stuff and really find what the strategies are at the front lines, because I'm in the front line. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we're in luck because the rest of the day is devoted to think tanks, and we have the entire day to go deeper in the issues. So you'll be able to find all of the speakers at different areas of the university where we can actually go deeper. Please allow me to thank the speakers. Join me in thanking the speakers once again.
Thank you very much, and this is the best way to really to start the day. So I think in our conversation moving forward, I think we would like actually this lively conversation to continue. And please remember, in our conversation, we want also, and what we heard is we need also to include others, like the living species, like the people around us from around the world, what is happening in different parts of the world. So please be mindful of that. So theoretically, we have about 300 people registered for this day. So we have 6 parallel sessions. We have 1 workshop, and total of 17 sessions, so separate sessions, plus the workshop. So if you do the math, there are about 40 to 45 people to generate 3 ideas. And that is the challenge that we are putting in front of you. So I invite you to come with an open mind, with love, this is what we heard yesterday, in your heart, and with respect to others, understanding for the nuances, and be part of this journey. We're trying to think big, we're trying to think about the future, but at the same time, we would like to hear some actions, what we can do tomorrow when we go home, what kind of challenges that we need to focus on. So we hope that you'll be able to contribute to the conversation in a constructive way. We encourage evidence-based conversation because yes, we are all emotional, we have own ideas, but we need, in order to have a constructive conversation, to be able to build some kind of common grounds, whatever those are. So it's a journey, we are going to work together. We would like to build a new partnership to get there. So that's what is the purpose of today. At the end of the day, we are going to have a reception where we're going to have the co-chairs, one of the co-chairs of the different track, to come up to the mic and for 2 minutes to say, we have been together for these 2 days or 3 days, and these are our biggest idea that we would like to take forward. And these are the new partnerships that we are able to build by being here. Tomorrow, a group of us will be convening to take all the notes. We have scribes on all the sessions, all the ideas. We'll try to clean them, organize them, collate them, create whatever is linkages and between them. And hopefully we can build in what we call the book of recommendations or the book of wisdom. Yeah. No. So seriously, it's a book of action-oriented, book of the mainstream of these kind of conversation we have. I'm not talking about the social mainstream. I'm talking about the mainstream, the ideas that we are able to develop. So please think in terms of if the evidence is so compelling. I'm saying not necessarily just the research evidence. It's the people who are talking about the front line. And the actions are clear. try to get bold ideas about call for actions, things that we need to start doing now at the personal level, at the together level, and at the community, at the local, at the regional, national, and international. If also you have strong opinion in your sessions about policies, things, I'm saying here policy in the wider term, meaning institutional kind of policies, whatever that is, private sector, public sector, civil society, our families, whatever, try to articulate that in ways that we can take them forward. And the last thing, this is an academic institution, and we love to have wicked problems. We love to have questions that we can focus on for the next 10, 20, 30 years. People can do their career trying to address those questions. So if it comes that you see it's difficult to get to any kind of agreements, those probably the areas of wicked problems. These may be the areas to start maybe articulating questions that we can put forward. We have a lot of bright minds here, and maybe we can try to push them forward. So we will so on some house clearing announcements, so the buses will start leaving here, I think around 4 or 4:10. So we need to be at the government house by 4:30, at the latest by 4:40. There is a reception that is being given in your honor, and the program will be very short, so we'll be having few kind of addresses, but mainly it's going to be about sharing with others the big, bold ideas that your session were able to produce. So I will be around, we will be around, we'll be going through the different sessions. If you need anything, let us know. The lunch will be offered here in this building, so we have to come back to the cafeteria for lunch. But mainly we are going to be in the DSB, which is actually a David Strong building, so there are people that will direct you there. If you are in the sessions 1 to 6, except the indigenous session, that will be happening in the First People's House. If you need anything for your sessions, it's something that come up and you need any kind of support, our team will be there to help you. We hope that you'll be able to finish by 3:30 in order to have some time at the end to be able to continue some kind of informal conversation, catch the buses, go to the reception, and then we'll say goodbye. All right, so thank you and enjoy the coffee.